Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to follow on Rich. I had not known what he was going to talk about. He probably didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I think it's going to be an interesting follow on. I did want to say one thing. As Rich pointed out, we've been thinking a lot about the long-term prospects for food demand. And so following on that paper that you cited there, Rich, we wrote a paper in Food Policy asking the question, given this tremendous uncertainty, and you underscore that, the demographic uncertainty. When I came into this, I thought demographers knew everything because we're all here and we're having, the kids are already born. They should know how many people they're going to be in 2050 or 2100. There is huge uncertainty there, both on the low side and the upside. I mean, half the countries in the world are now below replacement fertility. So there's the potential we're going to have a lot fewer people in the future. But if you look at this in a minimize your maximum regret framework, Rich, it kind of underscores your point. You don't want to be caught up short in the future without enough food. And so even though there's the potential downside of, potentially fewer people in the future, we should be investing more in public R&D. That paper underscores your point. I wanted to raise that before I get into other issues here. So I'm going to talk about agriculture, international trade, and sustainability. I decided to channel my inner Keith Fugely, so I'm going to be right on topic in terms of R&D and TFP. This is really a decades of long work with Yuris Baldos, Keith Fugely, and now Iman Hagigi on these topics. This is an overview. I'll talk about the food security sustainability challenge from a little bit different perspective than Rich. I think it'll be valuable. We'll talk about TFP, of course. Keith Fugely is involved in this and thinking about using that to increase output versus reduce input use and the footprint of agriculture, and talk about spillovers and relate this to food security, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of us now think about broadly about sustainability through the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So food is part of this, but there are many other things we're concerned with. We're concerned with poverty, we're concerned with health, we're concerned with education and water quality, air quality, and many other things. So there's 17 of these Sustainable Development Goals, and this was work we started in the UN Food System Summit and is now being reviewed in Nature Food, led by Ugo Valin, who you see there. This just goes through the literature, goes through the particular goals in the UN Sustainable Development Agenda and identifies which are synergistic and which are competitive with food security. SDG 2, adequate food for all, zero hunger. And you can see that the red really lights up around the environmental goals. That's where we have this. Many of them are very synergistic. If you were able to reduce poverty, you're able to enable people to buy the food that they need and attain zero hunger. So the problem really is that these things come together over the environment, and I think it relates back to Rich's talk in that regard. That's where the real trade-offs occur when we're thinking broadly about SDGs. So people who think about the environment a lot, I just spent almost a year at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research. They're thinking in terms of planetary boundaries. So we're now a lot of people on a small planet as opposed to a few people on a large planet, and we're challenging and stressing these planetary boundaries. I wanted to underscore it's not just climate. In fact, in this particular paper published in Science a few years ago, it's not climate change that's worrying these planetary boundary folks the most. It's biogeochemical flow. So too bad Kathy's not going to be here, but phosphorus and nitrogen. We've already blown past the planetary boundaries there. Biodiversity loss, again, we're in the red zone there. And agriculture is the main driver of those exceedances of planetary boundaries. So we need to be concerned about that. And if we want to live within these, we want to provide a planet to our children and grandchildren that isn't totally trashed. Projections to the future. This is so Ugo's paper is largely a survey of quantitative assessments out there on the broader SDG 2 question. And you can see that most of the studies show that we are continuing to exceed and will even more severely exceed these planetary boundaries, whether it's biodiversity, nitrogen, et cetera. So that's the broader context of food security and sustainability that I'll be thinking of, but I'm going to come back to some of the themes that Rich raised. And so Keith led a paper a number of us wrote in AEPP recently relating productivity growth to greenhouse gas emissions and thinking more generally about environment and land use. And so here you can see nicely laid out for low income, low middle, upper income, high income in these 4 panels, the trajectory of output growth, which is the blue, the trajectory of input use, which is the green, and the greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see to the extent you can boost productivity growth, you can really have benefits for the environment, in this case greenhouse gas emissions, but also for land use. So it underscores Rich's point and the Alston-Pardee points about the importance of investing in things that give you, well, encouraging faster productivity growth, whatever that is. I'll talk about that more now in a moment. So in Keith's framework, the framework we were using here, we're thinking about basically you invest in R&D, it boosts knowledge capital, kind of an unobserved intermediate input in this process, and that shifts your production function, whether it's your own R&D or, importantly, the spill-in knowledge capital. So Keith, a few years ago, wrote an important paper in the AEPP, it was that special anniversary issue, on TFP and knowledge capital, and he was able to relate productivity growth here in the diamonds so that's ag TFPs, you're reading that off the vertical axis. And here you're using his framework, which involves this investment in knowledge capital, building that up, that works through these elasticities, develops into productivity growth. And how much of this TFP, the diamonds, can we explain with historical R&D investments? And they're distinguished here between public, private, spillovers as well, and CGIAR in the developing countries. And you can see that for the high-income countries, you can explain most of the productivity growth through R&D. So back to Rich's point, it's important we have our eye on that if we're worried about future production. In the developing countries, it's a bit different. I mean, you can have these amazing one-off reforms. The reforms in China really boosted the rural economy and agriculture, reduced poverty. But those are one-off things, so they aren't going to go through that kind of reform again. So the R&D becomes more important, and China is now ahead of the U.S. in terms of both their public and the private R&D, according to Pardee and others. So CGIAR has also played an important role in the developing countries. So this is what are the sources of productivity growth over this historical period, relating it very much back to R&D of these very different sorts. Spill-ins are also important. So we invest in R&D in the US, and it benefits the European Union or Australia or perhaps Brazil. And those spill-ins have been important in Latin America in particular, but pretty much absent in Africa, and that's an important point. It's been very hard to transfer these innovations and technologies to Africa. R&D is a slow-moving train, and that comes back to this question about how many people are we going to have in the future, as Rich showed. It's a huge range of uncertainty. So we're making decisions now that are going to be determining how productive the food system is going to be in 2050 and 2100, this very long lag structure. So we did these estimates based on 100 years of public R&D data in the US that Keith Fugely had established. This is a Bayesian model that seeks to understand what's happening in between the money you're putting in and the productivity that's coming out. And we're able to fit this lag structure, and you can see that the lag money we spend today still is having an impact after 40 years. It doesn't peak for 20 years, which is kind of the life cycle of a student. You give them an assistantship in plant breeding or something, and it's a few years till they start being productive in the lab, and then they eventually learn these techniques, and by 20 years down the road, they have their own lab and they're doing stuff. So, and then their knowledge depreciates, unfortunately. But that's pretty much, so that's what we're looking at when we're thinking about long-run uncertainty, decisions we make. This is the key driver of productivity, and the decisions we're making now are going to shape future outcomes. So just underscoring Rich's point there. And this is developed by URIS based on Keith's data, just showing how much of the production today, this is a bit outdated, 2010, but is based on R&D, historical R&D. So, the brown is other drivers of output, and you can see most of the output growth from R&D and from R&D that was invested quite some time ago. So I want to come to an issue, it touches on Rich's talk from a little different angle, but do we use this productivity growth as a way to increase output, export more, lower food prices, or do we do it to reduce input use and have less of a footprint in agriculture, in the environment, on these planetary boundaries? So here's an interesting contrast Heisey and Fugely highlighted a few years ago, and it contrasts the US with Northwest Europe. So both of them have pretty strong productivity growth. That's the difference between the black line and the brown line. But the difference has been how that has translated into output. So in Northwest Europe, they've tended to reduce input use in agriculture. I have a picture there of one of my favorite places to go in eastern Germany, where this used to be a field, and now it's a rewilded area. But you can see that very different political decisions, and it touches on a number of the points that, it's a political choice. There they've decided they want these rewilded areas. They want to return land to nature. They haven't been contributing to the global, the food price decline that we've seen over this period to a great degree. I mean, we're been in another upward turn, but the long run trend over a century has been prices going down. So that indicates that there is sufficient food. Where we're headed in the future is of course a big question. What about in the US, though? We haven't been withdrawing resources from agriculture. We've been withdrawing labor, but we've been replacing it with chemicals and machinery and so on. And but there are stresses, environmental stresses in the US, and we have to confront these. And a lot of them are in California. And not far from Davis. So this is water, and it's not just the surface water, it's not just the Colorado River that's posing great challenges and causing farmland to be set aside, but the groundwater, a very severe, even more severe problem potentially. You can see on the right the ratio of groundwater withdrawals to recharge. And we're in some places in the Central Valley of California withdrawing 10 times recharge. So you can almost see the ground level dropping. And what happens if we address that? Well, turns out, here we've looked at, Iman Hagigi has looked at global drivers of groundwater. He's been able to look at apportion those to various things like population growth in Africa, income growth in Asia. What are the drivers of US groundwater? And the first point is they're mostly drivers overseas, not in the US. Total factor productivity growth in the US actually leads to more groundwater use, just because you become more competitive. Globally, of course, productivity growth reduces resource use. So what would happen if we withdrew some of this groundwater? In particular, if we said you can only withdraw a sustainable level of groundwater, you restrict yourself to recharge. And there are significant reductions in cropland, especially in California. This is super productive land right now. And as a result, so most of these impacts right along the fruitful rim, whether it's increases or decreases, that's where it occurs within the US. But globally, someone ends up needing to produce those almonds that people want and are going to demand, and they're produced elsewhere. Interesting thing is, in this scenario, actually, sustainable groundwater scenario, land use globally goes up because you're pulling out such highly productive land. So there are spillover effects if the U.S. engages in this policy and others do not. Let's talk more about spillovers, and let's get to the food security question. Rich has raised some issues about that. And I'm going to focus on sub-Saharan Africa because in our projections to 2050, that's where most of the undernourishment is by 2050. That's where the population growth is. That's where income growth has been lagging. And so focusing on sub-Saharan Africa for a minute as our kind of food security focus, what are the ways in which technology can influence food security outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, first of all, direct R&D. Spend more money on R&D in sub-Saharan Africa. As Keith shows, his work shows that R&D spent there has, domestically has been surprisingly unproductive given the potential for catch-up, and that's just has to do with the infrastructure. We have students from Purdue who go back to Africa and then they get frustrated, they give up, and they go somewhere else. So just having a productive R&D establishment is harder in the sub-Saharan Africa. CGIAR is helping to offset that, but that is a challenge. There's trade in technology, the spill-ins, okay? And we saw that's really important, say, in Latin America. It hasn't been so important in Africa to date. Maybe south-south spill-ins from Brazil, for example. There may be a potential there. So we explore that scenario in the paper, although I won't talk about it. And then there's a term we coined in this paper, virtual technology trade. And so I think that's some of what Rich had in mind, that you invest in technology in the US, this new technology allows you to export more stuff and other people import that. So it's like virtual water trade, you're importing their water. Here you're importing the US or the European technology. So we try to break those elements up in this analysis. So this is a historical analysis. Over this historical period, prices were declining in sub-Saharan Africa despite the rapid population growth. There wasn't much income growth over this period. So population was pushing, that's the non-tech component, pushing crop prices up. So this is showing crop prices on the horizontal axis. Overall, they fell because of technology. We decompose that into their own technology investments, the own R&D, the CGIAR, the virtual technology trade, and then interaction effects. And you can see their own investments, despite this limited productivity, were the dominant contributor to this price decline over this historical period. But it's different looking into the future. And it's different whether you're looking at a future with fluid trade, that is the integrated markets, a hypothetical future, trade economist nirvana, if you'll permit that term, versus the historically segmented markets. And if you think in the historically segmented world, I mean, there's a paper actually I'm discussant on Tuesday. O.B. Porteous from Middlebury College is presenting information on trade frictions within Africa, and they're huge. So much of Africa is isolated from international markets. So that's the historically segmented bar here. And you can see that projecting into the future, we project just a modest price decline in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because population growth is continuing to be very strong, and add income growth to that, the points that Rich was making, really drives demand up. What are the technology factors that are going to counter that? It's different in the future. We estimate that that's more due to virtual technology trade. You have these very strong growth in R&D in China, Brazil, elsewhere, benefiting them through lower prices. But if you think about that in terms of an integrated market, this is a totally hypothetical future where the world is flat for agricultural commodities. Everyone looks at the same price. The important thing there is that the demand growth in sub-Saharan Africa is spread across the world there. So the light bar, non-tech, shows that all of a sudden population growth in Africa isn't so critical for African production. Why? Because some of that's being satisfied by US producers or Chinese producers or Brazil. And so this trade, I just really want to highlight the importance of trade in this question, and it does relate back to some of the points implicitly that Rich was making. So the structure of trade is really important. Under both regimes, virtual technology trade is the dominant driver of keeping prices down in sub-Saharan Africa for urban consumers in the future. So you could also think about scenarios where the rest of the world goes along with Northwest Europe and starts withdrawing more resources from agriculture in favor of the environment. You're seeing it in China, their grain to green program, other kinds of things. And we explore that scenario a bit in the paper. I don't have time to go into that in detail here, but you can see we decompose the environmental restrictions by region on the right-hand side. And you can see that it's really what happens in China that's going to be maybe most important in terms of world markets, even in terms of sub-Saharan Africa in the future. It's such a big country, such a big source of demand and supply. So what they do will be important, especially under more integrated markets. And here just shows future reductions in non-farm undernutrition in our baseline. There are reductions. Those are less under this environmental sustainability scenario. So just to wrap up here, Gal, again, thanks for the invitation. Where's Gal here to speak here? But agricultural trade, productivity, growth, and sustainability are inextricably interwoven. I mean, these are all tied together. You can't look at one without thinking about the other. The public investments in R&D do boost TFB, conserve resources at a global level. Of course, at an individual level, if you're the country, at the frontier, you're going to expand your resource use if you become more competitive. Productivity growth can allow for withdrawal of natural resources from agriculture, as we've seen. That has implications for food prices, again, echoing Rich's theme. But some of that can be offset through greater market integration, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a great potential for food security in the future in sub-Saharan Africa, is just integrating them more into world markets. So I'll wrap up there. Oh, and my own advertising, GlassNet. Get with the program, glassnet.net. It's a network of networks funded by NSF. So we're bringing economists together with hydrologists and ecologists and others to address these sustainability challenges. Yeah.